A small wooden bird sits behind glass in Cairo. It is not large, it is not covered in gold, it does not look like the kind of object that should threaten anyone's understanding of ancient history, but from the right angle, it does something strange. Its wings stretch out straight from the body, its tail rises behind it, its body narrows toward the front. And if you are a modern person living in a world full of airplanes, drones, rockets, and flight simulations, one thought arrives almost automatically: that does not look only like a bird, it looks like a plane. That resemblance turned the Saqqara bird into one of the internet's favorite ancient technology mysteries. Some people look at it and see a toy, some see a ritual object, some see a simple representation of a bird, and some see evidence that ancient Egyptians may have understood flight thousands of years before the modern age. That is the claim that made it famous, not because the object clearly proves aviation, but because the human mind loves the moment when an ordinary artifact seems to become impossible. One wooden bird, one airplane-shaped silhouette, one dangerous question: what if the ancient world knew more than we think? But the better question is slower. What exactly are we seeing? Are we seeing ancient aerodynamics, or are we seeing our own century reflected back at us through a piece of wood? The Saqqara bird is not powerful because it proves ancient flight. It is powerful because it exposes the fragile line between curiosity and projection. And once you see that line, many other impossible artifacts begin to look very different. Before the theories, before the replicas, before the YouTube thumbnails and the ancient aviation claims, there is the object itself. The Saqqara bird is a small wooden artifact from Egypt, commonly dated to around the Ptolemaic period, roughly the last few centuries before the Common Era. It is usually described as being made from sycamore wood. Its wingspan is often given at about 18 centimeters. It was reportedly discovered in the Saqqara necropolis near Memphis, one of the most important burial landscapes in ancient Egypt. That setting matters. Saqqara was not an empty desert where a mysterious aircraft model happened to fall from the sky. It was a dense religious and funerary landscape. For centuries, Egyptians buried their dead there, built tombs there, placed offerings there, and filled the ground with objects that connected the living, the dead, the gods, and the afterlife. So before we ask whether this object could fly, we have to ask a more basic question. What kind of world did it come from? Because archaeology is not only about shape, it is about context. Where was the object found? What was found with it? What materials were used? Are there similar objects? Do texts or images explain its purpose? Is there wear on the surface that tells us how it was handled? Does the object belong to a known tradition, or does it stand alone? These questions are less exciting than ancient airplane, but they are the questions that protect us from fooling ourselves. The Saqqara bird was not discovered with landing gear. It was not found with a launching frame. It was not found with calculations. It was not found in a workshop full of experimental flight models. It was not found with a row of similar test objects showing gradual aerodynamic improvement. What we have is a bird-shaped wooden object from a culture where birds were already deeply meaningful. That should not end the mystery, but it should change the way we enter it. The first job is not to decide whether it looks like an airplane. The first job is to understand what a bird meant in ancient Egypt. The glider theory did not become popular by accident. It became popular because the silhouette is genuinely suggestive. If you look at the Saqqara bird from above, you can understand why people pause. There is a central body. There are broad wings. There is a tail. The design feels clean and almost technical. It does not look like a soft, rounded, naturalistic sculpture. It has a sharpness to it. It looks simplified, and simplified shapes are exactly what modern technology has trained us to read as design. A modern airplane is not shaped like a bird feather by feather. It is shaped like an idea of flight. Body wings, tail balance, lift. So when we see an ancient object with those elements, we do not only see an animal, we see engineering. That is the psychological hook, and it is a strong one. The story becomes even more tempting when modern enthusiasts build replicas. Some reconstructions add a horizontal tailplane or stabilizer, then demonstrate that the modified object can glide on camera. That can feel like proof. You see a replica move through the air. You see it stay aloft for a moment. You hear someone say the original may have been a model aircraft, and the mystery feels solved. But the evidence is more delicate than that. If a replica only flies after adding a part that is not preserved on the artifact, then the added part becomes the argument. The experiment may show that a modern maker can turn the form into a glider. It does not automatically show that the ancient object was intended to be one. That difference is everything. It is the difference between this shape can be modified into something that glides, and this object was designed as a glider. Those are not the same claim. One is a modern experiment. The other is an archaeological conclusion, and the second claim needs much stronger evidence. This episode turns on one sentence. Capability is not intention. A plate can skim through the air. That does not mean plates were invented as flying machines. A child can throw a sandal and make it rotate. That does not mean sandals are ancient propellers. A curved object can create some lift under the right conditions. That does not mean its maker understood aerodynamics. This sounds obvious when the examples are silly, but impossible artifact stories often depend on forgetting it. They begin with a resemblance. Then they demonstrate a possible function. Then they quietly treat that function as the original purpose. The Saqqara Bird is vulnerable to exactly that move. It looks winged. It can be reconstructed into a gliding form. Therefore, the story says it must have been connected to flight technology, but archaeology cannot stop there. It has to ask whether the object's strongest explanation fits the full pattern of evidence material. Context, where, comparative objects, iconography, textual evidence, cultural meaning. And when we apply that wider test, ancient aviation becomes a much weaker explanation, not because ancient Egyptians were unintelligent. That is never the point. Ancient Egyptian civilization produced extraordinary architecture, mathematics, medicine, administration, craft traditions, and religious art. The issue is not whether ancient people were capable of sophisticated thought. The issue is whether this specific object proves this specific claim. And on that question, the evidence is thin. The Saqqara Bird may be beautifully made. It may be symbolically important. It may have been handled, displayed, played with, dedicated, or buried for reasons we do not fully understand, but none of that requires it to be a machine. The past is allowed to be intelligent without secretly becoming modern. One of the biggest problems for the glider theory is stability. Modern aircraft do not fly only because they have wings. They fly because many design features work together. Weight distribution matters, wing shape matters, the center of gravity matters, the tail matters, control surfaces matter. Even a simple glider is not just a bird shape thrown into the air. It is a balanced system. The Saqqara Bird, as preserved, does not give us that system clearly. This is why some reconstructions add a tailplane. The added stabilizer helps the replica behave more like a glider. But again, that creates a serious interpretive problem. Was the stabilizer originally there and lost? Maybe wooden artifacts can break, small parts can disappear. Absence is not always proof. But if the most important flight feature is missing, then we need evidence that it existed. A slot, a break, a trace, a comparable intact example. An ancient depiction, something. Without that, the stabilizer is not evidence recovered from the artifact. It is a modern solution added to make the theory work. That does not make the builders dishonest. It makes the experiment limited. Experimental archaeology can be extremely useful, but only when we are clear about what is being tested. If we test the original shape and it flies poorly, that tells us one thing. If we modify the shape until it flies, that tells us something else. The second experiment may reveal aerodynamic potential, but it cannot by itself reveal ancient intention. The Saqqara Bird sits right in that gap. The gap between what a modern reconstruction can do and what an ancient object was. To understand why a bird-shaped object does not need to be an aircraft, we have to step into a world where birds were already powerful. Ancient Egypt was full of bird imagery. Falcons, vultures, ibises, geese, ducks, swallows, hawks. Birds appeared in art, writing, religion, kingship, funerary belief, and everyday life. The falcon was tied to Horus and royal power. The ibis became associated with Thoth, writing, wisdom, and sacred knowledge. The vulture could be protective and maternal. The ba, often represented with bird-like features, was connected to a person's spiritual existence after death. Birds crossed boundaries. They moved between earth and sky. They appeared in marshes, temples, tombs, and myths. They were living creatures, food sources, symbols, divine signs, and images of transformation. In that world, a bird-shaped object from a funerary or ritual landscape does not need a mechanical explanation to be meaningful. It may have stood for flight in a symbolic sense. Not flight as aviation, flight as passage, flight as soul, flight as divine movement, flight as escape from the limits of the body. That is not less interesting than a glider. In some ways, it is more interesting because it asks us to stop treating every ancient mystery as a failed version of our technology. Maybe the object was not trying to become an airplane. Maybe it was already doing something an airplane cannot do. It was carrying meaning. The simplest explanations are not always the weakest. One possibility is that the Saqqara bird was a toy. Small animal objects are common across many cultures. Children play with miniature forms of the world around them. A child in ancient Egypt could easily have handled a wooden bird, moved it through the air, imagined it flying, or used it in play. That is possible. But we should be careful here too. Toy can become a lazy label. Sometimes scholars and viewers use the word toy when an object is small and its meaning is unclear. Not every small thing belonged to a child. Not every simple object is playful. The ritual explanation has a similar problem. Ritual object can be accurate, but it can also become a polite way of saying we do not know. So the honest answer may be more complicated than either label. The Saqqara bird could have been playful and symbolic at the same time. It could have been decorative and meaningful. It could have been attached to something else. It could have belonged to a model scene, a burial arrangement, a votive practice, or a display context that is now lost. It could have represented a bird in a way that made perfect sense to its maker, even if the category does not survive for us. Modern people like clean labels, toy tool machine. Ritual object, art, but ancient objects often refuse those categories. The same object could be beautiful, useful, sacred, playful, and symbolic. The problem may not be that the artifact is mysterious. The problem may be that our labels are too small. The Saqqara bird became famous because it offers a perfect internet mystery. It is visual. You can understand the claim in one image. It is ancient. It comes from Egypt, a civilization already surrounded by popular mystery. It seems technological. It invites a forbidden question, and it lets the viewer feel like they are seeing something experts overlooked. That feeling is powerful. It gives the audience a role. You're not just learning history, you're discovering hidden history. You're becoming the person who noticed the obvious thing everyone else ignored. That is emotionally satisfying, but it is also risky, because once a theory makes you feel like an insider, evidence can start to feel like an enemy. If an archaeologist says the object is probably not a glider, that can sound like closed-mindedness. If a museum labels it as a bird, that can sound like a cover-up. If aerodynamic tests are inconclusive, that can be brushed aside as missing parts or poor reconstruction. The theory becomes hard to disprove because every weakness becomes part of the mystery. That is how speculation protects itself. And that is why this artifact is useful for our series. It teaches a skill the audience can use again and again. Do not ask only, "Can I imagine a surprising explanation?" Ask, "What evidence would I expect if that explanation were true?" For ancient aviation, we would expect more than one ambiguous bird. We would expect patterns, failures, experiments, texts, depictions, tools, workshop evidence, objects with consistent aerodynamic features. If those things are missing, the claim does not become impossible, but it becomes much less likely. The Saqqara bird is a mirror. It shows us the past, but it also shows us ourselves. We live after flight. We live after the Wright brothers, after jet engines, after satellites, after drones, after childhood toys shaped like planes. Our eyes have been trained, so when we see straight wings and a tail, we do not approach the shape neutrally. We carry an entire modern world into the glass case. That does not make us foolish. It makes us human. Pattern recognition is one of the ways the mind survives. We compare new things to known things. We use resemblance to move quickly. But resemblance can betray us. It can turn a bird into a glider, a jar into a battery, a carving into a light bulb, a corroded mechanism into a computer from a lost civilization, a hammer and stone into proof that geology is wrong. The first glance is not the problem. The first glance is curiosity. The problem begins when we refuse to take the second step, the step where we ask what else the object could be, the step where we ask what evidence is missing, the step where we let the ancient culture be different from us. The Saqqara bird asks for that second step. It asks us to pause between looks like and was used as. That pause is where better history begins. If the Saqqara bird really were evidence of ancient Egyptian aerodynamics, the case would need more than resemblance. It would need a pattern. Imagine a group of similar objects, all built with consistent aerodynamic features. Imagine some with repaired wings, some with broken noses, some with wear marks from repeated launching. Imagine a workshop context with tools and unfinished prototypes. Imagine depictions of people throwing or testing bird-shaped models. Imagine a text describing a wooden bird that traveled through the air as a demonstration, a game, a ritual, or an experiment. Imagine an intact example with a preserved tailplane, balanced in a way that clearly supports controlled gliding. If we had that kind of evidence, the conversation would change, not because it would instantly prove ancient aircraft in the modern sense, but because it would move the idea from visual resemblance toward archaeological pattern. That is what strong claims need. They need repeatability. They need context. They need independent lines of evidence. Without those, the glider theory remains possible in the weakest sense. Possible like many things are possible, but not well supported, and that distinction matters. A good mystery does not need to pretend weak evidence is strong. The mystery can survive honesty. In fact, honesty usually makes it better, because then we are no longer defending a fantasy. We are studying a real object from a real culture, with all its uncertainty intact. Here's the twist. The ancient aircraft version may actually make the Saqqara Bird smaller. It reduces the object to a yes or no question. Was it a plane? If yes, history is rewritten. If no, the object becomes a disappointment. But that is a poor way to treat the past. The better mystery is not whether Egyptians secretly built aircraft. The better mystery is why this object was made at all. Who carved it? Was it made quickly or carefully? Was it copied from a real bird? Was it placed with the dead? Was it handled by a child? Was it displayed? Was it attached to another object? Did it refer to a deity, a soul, a protective idea, a ritual movement, or a story now lost? Those questions do not explode into a viral headline as easily, but they respect the artifact more. They let it belong to its own world, and they remind us that ancient people did not exist only to foreshadow modern inventions. They had their own symbols, their own metaphors, their own fears, their own afterlife, their own ways of imagining the sky. The Saqqara Bird may not be a broken model airplane. It may be something stranger to us, a bird that meant exactly what it needed to mean in a world we only partly understand. So what is the Saqqara Bird? The honest answer is not as simple as the legend. It is a wooden bird-shaped artifact from ancient Egypt. It has a form that modern eyes can read as aerodynamic. Some replicas and reconstructions have explored whether similar shapes can glide, but the evidence for it being an intentional aircraft model is weak. The missing stabilizing features, the lack of supporting context, the absence of a broader pattern, and the powerful role of bird symbolism all point toward a more cautious interpretation that does not make the object boring. It makes it more human. The Saqqara Bird shows how a single shape can hold two worlds at once. The ancient world that made it, and the modern world that misrecognizes it. We see wings and think of machines. They may have seen wings and thought of gods, souls, protection, play, death, or sky. Neither reaction is random, but only one belongs to the object's original world. That is the lesson. Resemblance is not evidence by itself. Possibility is not proof. A successful reconstruction is not automatically an ancient intention. And curiosity becomes stronger when it learns to slow down. The Saqqara Bird probably tells us less about ancient aviation than some people want, but it tells us something more useful. It teaches us how mystery is made, not only in the sand, not only in the museum, but in the split second when the eye sees a bird, the mind sees a plane, and the imagination tries to turn resemblance into history. If you want another ancient object where modern assumptions create the mystery, watch the Baghdad battery. Next one. Object looks like a glider. The other looks like a battery. In both cases, the hard question is not what we can make it do now. It is what it meant then.